Hi there, everybody. My name is Lauren Spring, and I'm an art educator with the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I am really extra excited this morning because I have one of my colleagues joining us. This is Sjouke, and she works in the conservation department at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And she specializes in contemporary art and in plastics. And so we have a really extra fun session planned for you today, where we're going to learn about the work that she does, something that goes on, really behind the scenes at the Art Gallery of Ontario. When we're walking through the building and looking at the paintings and sculptures and photographs, we don't always think about how, they stay in their good condition over so many years, and all of the effort that goes into keeping them, vibrant and just as they are. And so Sjouke will shed some light on that. And before we launch into that, I just want to take a quick moment to thank the AGO community who are generously supporting these virtual school programs, and especially the Michael Young Family Foundation. We're so grateful for your help in bringing art to students when we can't actually be walking through the museum together. Here is the beautiful Art Gallery of Ontario, located in downtown Toronto. And we know that many of you have visited already in person with your schools and with your families and friends, and might live near the gallery. But others we know are joining us from outside of Toronto, some of you outside of Ontario, many of you from outside of Canada, some from outside North America. So wherever you may be joining us from today, we're really glad you're here, and we have some really fun learning ahead. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land the AGO is on is Mishki-Sagad Anishinaabe territory, Mississauga. It is also governed by a treaty between the Mississauga of the Credit and the Canadian government. Toronto is Mishki-Sagad Anishinaabe territory, and it's also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat confederacies. And this particular session today is designed for students from grade 4 to grade 8. And we are going to delve into now the wonderful world of plastics. So I don't know, Sjouke, if you want to start by maybe just telling us a little bit about what you do and kind of what your studio looks like at the AGO. And then we can go through the slides a little bit more carefully.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the conservator. I'm a conservator at the AGO, specialized in contemporary art. And with contemporary art, it like an artwork can consist of like pretty much any material that you can think of, and plastics are one of them that we are dealing with on a very like regular basis. And with plastics, the biggest question we always get is because plastics are new materials, and we all know them as like a new material. So the question that I always get is why plastics already need attention, because they are new, so they should be fine, right? But that is definitely not the case.
And I suppose as a
or not always.
Yeah, and I would suppose as a new material, it means there's not, hundreds and hundreds of years of conservation work that's already taken place. So a lot of it is new too to the field, and
exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's definitely definitely like a new material that still a lot of research needs to be done to understand what plastics actually are, because there's still a lot of mysteries around it, especially about how they decay.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I think, some students might not realize, but when you walk through a gallery, if you're looking at work that's, 300 or 400 years old, it's typically, oil paint on wood panel, or then we have more recent ones that are on canvas. But plastics it's relatively new that artists are using this as part of their process and the materials of choice. And so it's very exciting what Sjouke is doing. And we have, I should point, go for it.
Oh yeah, so if you go to the next slide, maybe because I made some photos of the next one.
The next one.
I made photos. I just walked through my house of examples of plastics. Oh, there. This is a good example. So if you walk through your house, you see so many different types of plastic, right? I mean, you have plastic bottles. And like I have here this pot, like the handle is plastic, and this toy for my baby is all plastic. scissors, and also my pen here is plastic. But also, like I don't know if you all know this, but this painting, for example, is painted with acrylic paint, which is also all plastic. Like the tube is plastic, but the paint itself is also plastic. So we sometimes don't realize how much plastic is around in our lives. Like my headphones are plastic, but even like your face mask here is also all plastic. It's pretty incredible how much plastic we have in our lives and how dependent we are on it.
That's a great point. We have a few students who are writing in plastic all the time, like in our laptops, they're made out of plastic, and the phones we use, totally.
Yeah, it's definitely, you just cannot think about a life without plastic anymore, because if you take out all the plastic in our lives, like what would we do, right?
Yeah, I see too. You have a picture kind of some food like inside a fridge. Yeah, and
the plastic bags,
everything.
But even like my bike tire, it's a rubber, which is also plastic. It's all plastic.
Yeah, and so it's a big span, and it's great because Sjouke has prepared for us, kind of a more scientific approach to the different types of plastics and how those might make a difference when we're talking about conservation. Should I go to this slide next, Sjouke?
Sure. So I was thinking, like, because probably, I mean, plastics are so part of our lives, but do you know actually what plastics are? Like, what are plastics?
That is a good question, folks. Does anyone want to take a guess? Anyone out there? You can type into the Q&A, like, what is plastic? Like, if you had to define it, what is it? So we could hear what some of your guesses are, and then I'm sure that Sjouke has a good working definition herself, being an expert in the field. So what are plastics? What are they anyway? Someone is saying, yeah, synthetic material related to oil in some way. Well, oil is shaped and formed.
So, like the oil is definitely, because that is the thing with plastics. Plastics, in other words, that in the chemistry that we use for plastics is synthetic polymers or synthetic materials. And the big difference between synthetic materials is that it's opposite from natural materials, and synthetic materials are all the materials that are made by humans. So all the materials that are not occurring in nature by itself. And that is what defines plastic from any other materials, is that it's man-made, it's made from oil, and it's made in factories. And it's called synthetic polymers or synthetic materials for that reason. So maybe if you can go to the next slide.
Sure. This one here?
Yeah, so here I just quickly picked out a couple of, like, 3 examples of plastics. And that is the thing with the word plastic. Like, we use the word plastic for all sorts of materials, but you can see here, like, a rubber tire is not the same as a toothbrush or a safety goggle. But and that's also because they are all made of different plastics. So there are different kinds of plastics. So plastics is just a name for all sorts of synthetic materials. It's the same almost if you call dogs, but there's a difference between a husky and a chihuahua, and that's the same with plastic. Like, this toothbrush is different than the safety goggle, but you still call them all plastics.
That's a really good point. And I wonder, Sjouke, if you could shine some light on, like, why were plastics even invented?
So plastics were invented in the 19th century. There was, like, lots of focus on making new materials, like better materials that are better than nature. And the biggest motivation of inventing plastic was mostly to imitate, like, natural materials. So, for example, in the past, like before plastics were discovered, they, like, for jewelry, they used, for example, turtle shells or like the horns of cows to make jewelry. And in the 19th century, when plastics were invented, they were capable of making these materials, to imitate these materials with plastics, and that they didn't have to use like the real animal materials anymore. So it was mostly the plastics were mostly invented to imitate natural materials. But with plastics, the goal was to make it even better than natural materials. So it would be even stronger and even like lasting longer. And that was the whole idea with plastics, that it would be better than natural materials. But right now we see that it is actually not really the case, because, well, as we all know, plastics definitely have they form now a big problem in the world regarding like recycling and just the environment.
There's some students have been kind of noticing that. They're saying, why can't we take apart and reuse the toxic chemicals and elements in plastic? I think, there's definitely a growing awareness here about plastic. Someone else in the chat was suggesting, as useful as they are, we know that they're bad for the environment, but maybe then it's a good thing to turn into art, because rather than throw it in a landfill, maybe, there are lots of artists who are sort of repurposing plastic items that might have otherwise gone in the trash and then become art, and it's kind of a second life for them. Someone else has asked if you know who came up with the idea of inventing plastic, if it was just one person, or I don't know. If it gets the credit.
That's good. I mean, I know it shows if I paid attention during my, my classes when I was younger. I think let's think. There was in the end of the 19th century, there was a man called Bakelite, and he is still seen as the inventor of like the plastics how we know them as today. Like he was the first man who was capable of making a fully synthetic material that was not natural at all and just used oil products to develop this plastic, and it was called bakelite, and it was this really heavy black plastic that was used for the old telephones. I don't know if you can recall like the really old telephones that you sometimes still see in old movies, where they have like the horn and it's like a black telephone, like heavy plastic. And when that plastic became so popular, so a lot of like telephones and televisions were made of it. But the problem with that plastic was that it was also extremely brittle. So if you dropped it, it just fell in 1,000 pieces. So that was not great. And then over time they improved the plastic so it became more flexible, or more, the colors could be added, all those things. So in the 20th century, the research and development of plastics definitely went skyrocketing, because
Great.
it's so, you can go anywhere with plastics. You can pretty much make whatever you want.
That's a good segue too, because a few students have been asking like, what kind of art can you even do with plastic? And you just hold tight, guys, because we're going to show you some examples in a few minutes. People are asking if paintings are displayed on plastic. Typically not. Typically it's more contemporary art. So artists who are sort of moving away from traditional, maybe like sculpture, like bronze and marble and wood sculpture and oil and, well, I mean, as Sjouke said, acrylic paint does have plastic in it too. But yeah, mainly the artwork that we're talking about today is more contemporary sculpture. So using different, sometimes everyday objects, and then turning them into something completely different. So we will have some neat examples to show you as we go too. So let's move on to, would you like to discuss this slide?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so I was like, I already said this, but plastics are in chemistry also called synthetic polymers. And polymers are, this is a microscope photo of polymers. And it's almost like a massive bowl of spaghetti. So if you just like, for example, if you look at this scissor with the microscope, and you need like a very strong microscope for this. We don't have one of those microscopes in the HEO because this is extremely scientific. But if you zoom in this plastic, you will eventually see this here on the screen, and it looks like a big bowl of spaghetti, and it are all strains, and every strain is called a polymer. And the word polymer is coming from the Greek language, where poly means many and mer, or polymers means parts, so it means like many parts, and that is a polymer.
Neat. And
yeah, so if you go back to like the synthetic versus, like if you go back to, I think
here,
there, because that is another thing. So I'm talking already about natural polymers versus synthetic polymers, because polymers are always existing in nature. So natural polymers are, for example, wood or wool or silk or jute in this case. So there are a lot of natural polymers that exist in nature, and there are all these materials that are extremely strong. Like if you think about wool, for example, we can make sweaters out of it. So you can imagine how strong those polymers are, that on like molecular level, they are so like tied together that we can use that material and make something very strong like a wool sweater out of it. And then on the other hand, you have the synthetic polymers. So I already talked about that. That is all the materials that are made by humans. But yeah, it's pretty cool to realize that polymers are already existing in nature. So like also thinking about, can we replace plastics? We definitely can, because there is already a lot of other polymers in nature that can be used in a very smart way, and we already do. So
yeah, and it seems that a lot of students, it seems many of you have maybe, you know, in different science classes or other courses at school are learning how dangerous plastics are for the environment. And it seems that many students are yeah, pretty concerned about their use. And I think rightly so, because we do know that they're hurting the environment. We also know that, you know, this is a kind of recent discovery, because plastics themselves are a relatively recent invention, that, you know, humans maybe didn't use this precautionary principle and look generations and generations ahead to think, oh, how might this new invention actually impact the world we live in? So, and we will, I think we'll have some time for some of these other questions that are coming up as we go along. But I'd like to keep going, because we have a few more slides and examples to share with you, and then I think some of these questions will be answered too as we move through. So
shall I? So if you look at the bowl of spaghetti again, like a polymer, you have to look at the strain. Like each strain is a polymer, and it's almost like, I was thinking, like if you think about the polymer like as a necklace, like the beads here, like a beaded necklace, like every bead is a different molecule. So a polymer is all constructed from different molecules, and that makes eventually what the characteristics of a polymer are. So that is why there are so many different plastics, because you can design a polymer like in any kind of way. You can use all sorts of different molecules with different characteristics, and you can combine them and make new materials out of that.
So neat. And then we have a question. A student is asking, could I make plastic at home? I won't do it, but I'm just curious. I don't think
yes, you can.
You?
Yeah, you can.
Maybe you can, but we won't give you the recipe.
I don't think your parents will be happy with that.
Is this a good one next, Sjouke?
Yeah, so this is a good, like if you think about, like for example, the beads, and here I showed like the molecular construction. Oh, if you go back again, like if the molecular construction of every plastic. So if you think about the bead and what I said, like you construct them with different molecules to make a characteristic plastic out of it. And here I give an example of how those like beads look like for two types of plastic. So here I have an example of like a yogurt container, and you can see it's just the carbon and the hydrogen molecules, so the C and the H's, and it's just a long string of those molecules. But if you look at the records, for example, then you see that instead of one hydrogen, they also put like a chloride there. So that's the Cl, and it makes a completely different plastic, because a record is completely different than than a yogurt container. And it's just because of one different molecule. So I think that is pretty fascinating, that just by like a switch of one different molecule, you can create something completely different.
Wow. Yeah. And some of those, one of the teachers was saying, students don't know what records are.
I can grab a record.
They're essentially old versions of your Spotify account, basically. Yeah, and they are making a comeback. You'll see them. And I think, yeah, for some of you who are probably maybe, grade 7 and 8 or older than that, if you're joining us, and there's the same record. Look at that.
The record.
This kind of chemical, arrangement will make a lot of sense to you, and others might be thinking, what are these letters doing here? And science classes of the future will help you make sense of this. But it is so interesting to see these different formations and how they form a completely different texture and object, really.
Yeah, just by one different molecule, it's it makes it different.
Do you want to talk about this too, Sjouke, the thermoplastic?
Sure. Because I think one thing that I was always thinking about, why are some plastics like the scissors, for example, is super hard plastic, and this is also extremely hard plastic, but then the yogurt container is very soft plastic. And then you also have for example, the tire of my bike is also plastic, but that one is rubbery. And I always thought why is that? And it is actually because when you look at the polymers, if you look at a bowl of spaghetti, for example, with this type of plastic, the strains of polymers are just sort of floating around, like what you see here with the thermoplastic. It's just a pile of the strains all together. But because it's the same if you put your hand in a bowl of spaghetti, you can sort of mold it and it's flexible. But with this one, for example, you still that is the thermoset, you still have that bowl of spaghetti, but in the meantime, all the strains are connected with each other. So there are little bridges in between all the different polymers, which makes them really fixed, because there are all these bridges between all the polymers, and that makes it actually that it's hard. So if you go to the next slide, let's see. If you go one more, I think, and make an example of give some examples there. Yeah, here. So there's a difference between thermoplastics, thermosets, and rubbers. And I always compare it with a thermoplastic is kind of like a chocolate. Chocolate is hard, but if you melt it, it becomes soft. But then if it cools down, it becomes hard again. And that is exactly what your yogurt container also will do. If you melt it, it will melt. But if it's or if you put heat it up, it will melt. But then once it cools down again, it will get it's the hard, or not a hard plastic, but this type of plastic again. And a thermoset, like the scissors, for example, it's almost like how you make cookies. You put all your ingredients together, you bake it, and then you get a cookie. And that is just you cannot change that shape anymore. It is what it is. It is hard and rigid. Mm-hmm. And then with rubbers, it's it's also there, you add something in the polymers that makes it nice and flexible, and then it gets kneadable, and it becomes like a rubber. So there's definitely those three differences in plastics. When you talk about plastics, you make a difference between thermoplastics, thermosets, and rubbers, and that are the three sort of main categories that you can place your plastic under.
Interesting. And we have a question from a student. Are any of these three plastics particularly dangerous to the earth and the environment, or are they all kind of on the same level?
The ones that I show?
Yeah. Is there one type that's more or less dangerous for the environment?
There are definitely, for example, this yogurt container is very recyclable and not harmless. It doesn't have any harmless chemicals in it, so it's safe for us to use. And because it's a thermoplastic, you can melt it really easy. And that means also that when they recycle this, they can melt this really easy, and then make something new out of it. So they can make new yogurt containers out of it, or they can, this is the same plastic, so they can make also plastic toys out of it. So this is really good for recycling. But for example, this one, like the thermoset, because you cannot once you baked it, like the cookie, you cannot change the cookie anymore. So, or you cannot change this. So this is very it's a different, like, it's definitely a different plastic and harder to recycle, and sometimes impossible to recycle. So then it happens that it just goes into landfill, and then it's decays, and that sometimes takes like a very, very, very long time.
Great questions, guys. I thought maybe we'd show you an example. Some folks have been asking, okay, this is so interesting, but like, what kind of art is made out of plastic? It's hard to picture. And so here's one example. This is by an artist named Do-Ho Soo, who's a South Korean artist, but he's also lived in other cities in the world. And this is a really neat piece that the AGO owns and sometimes has up on display, where he basically recreated his entire New York City apartment. We just have the bathroom here in this image. But he actually, he was moving around so much, and he, one of his main themes that he explores in his work is this idea of movement and migration. And so many of us, we're not born in the country that we live in, or, our parents weren't. And so we're a real global world right now. And that's one of the things that, he's kind of obsessed with in his artwork, and that also makes him feel melancholy about leaving places. And so when he was moving away from New York City, he thought, oh, here's one way I can sort of memorialize this chapter of my life and this particular apartment that I loved. And so he made the entire thing out of nylon, kind of using interesting computer technology and traditional South Korean sewing techniques. And so if you actually were to walk through the entire installation, you would actually feel like you were walking through his entire apartment. But yeah, we just have the bathroom here, and you can see written underneath the title and the artist's name is that it's made out of nylon and stainless steel armature. And so here's an example of something, Sjouke, that, maybe when you were back in art school, you might never have thought you'd have to take care of a piece like this. But what would be some concerns, or like when you look at this one, how do we take care of this at the AGO? What do you have to think about?
So in this case, because the biggest factors that ages plastics are light and oxygen. So when we display something like when we display this artwork in the AGO, we definitely keep an eye on how much light are we using for this artwork. So we want to have it as less as possible. And also using LED lights is also very helpful. And also where we have to be really careful is that, because it's such a fragile artwork. So like, even if you touch it with your hands, like the salts that are in your hands can affect the plastic. So people cannot touch the artwork at all. So even if you're in the museum and you want to touch something, don't do it, because it definitely can affect like the way it ages over time. And nylon, actually, which is pretty cool, is the same material as your stockings. I don't know if you can explain it better, like what women wear under their
like pantyhose type thing.
Right. Yeah, so it's exactly the same material, but this one has just a different color.
Yeah, and unfortunately we're already at time today. I know there's so many more questions. We could have done like a 2-hour session, I think, with Sjouke. But yeah, we're going to have to leave it at that today because our time is up. But I hope this has given you a good sense of, where plastics come from and how they're starting to be used in the art world today. And then folks who have jobs like Sjouke that combine art and science and all of this really, really important knowledge as we move forward. And like a lot of you have noted and we're concerned by, what is the future of plastics? Are we cutting back? What do we do with them? Why are they in museums in the first place? So a lot of really important big questions. So I want to thank you so much, Sjouke, for sharing your knowledge with us today and all of your expertise. I know I learned a lot. I'm going to look at these works differently too. Thanks very much, everybody.